Today I'm going to be showing you how to create a dance pop track in the style of Dua Lipa. This stuff is super fun to make, and it's kind of the origin of music that got people moving on the dance floor. And as somebody who grew up listening to 70s records, I'm really happy that this sound is coming back. There's going to be funky guitars, fat snare drums, really catchy bass lines, and a whole lot more. But before we jump into it, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I produce music under the name Velvet Ear. I work as a song completion producer, meaning I specialize in taking songwriter song ideas and turning them into finished tracks ready for Spotify. I make one of these videos every Thursday to show people how to create their own pop music at home. Songs I've produced and written have been on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you have a pop song that you wrote that's been burning a hole in your pocket, check out the top link in the description, and let's see if we can get that thing finished. All right, onto the track. So let's start by looking at what the track sounds like. All right, let's start looking at some of the elements in this track. I would say definitely the main part of the song is this chord progression here, which is this corridor junk piano preset in Absinthe. When I was writing this chord progression, I wanted something that had a lot of sevenths in it. So as you can see, all of these are playing seventh chords. All of them except this one, which is an augmented chord. So this is an F augmented chord, which really adds that sort of like chromatic funk walk-up feel. You can really hear it here. So this sort of like walking up the progression and walking back down using chromatic chord movements. I don't know, it's really funky and it lends itself really well to this sort of style of music. Also, I accidentally misplaced a MIDI note here on accident when I was tracking it, but it kind of sounded good. It kind of sounded like a mistake that a keyboard player would make. So I just decided to keep it in. But yeah, that MIDI is being duplicated across multiple tracks. So I'm essentially using different key sounds in different octave ranges and blending them together into this bus to get the kind of sound that I want. So we have the synth that I just went through, this one, which is that exact same sound, but an octave up. And it's just kind of blended underneath that one, just to sort of extend that higher range. We then have a couple of pianos. So we have this guy, which is kind of like the stereotypical tech house piano sound. And I got it from using the grand piano preset in Ableton, using some EQ and compression, and then quite a bit of OTT with the lows turned down, just to kind of squash it and make the dynamics of it really flatlined. And then I wanted to double that piano up with an octave higher, but when I duplicated that exact same sound, it didn't really have the effect that I was looking for. So I took that exact same patch, but applied it to this modern upright from Addictive Keys and did the exact same thing that I did with these two synths. I just sort of blended this higher octave up a bit just to give this lower one sort of a higher register. But yeah, all of these guys are going into this group, and we're using some RC20 to sort of wobble things up a bit more, degrade the audio quality with this magnetic part, some distortion, and then some EQ. And for the first time, I'm actually using Soothe for its main intended purpose, which is getting rid of extraneous sort of resonant frequencies. But altogether, they sound like this. So it's really big and fat and bright and wide. And you can actually hear when I take the beat and I play it without those keys, it sounds so empty. These keys are honestly a background sounding element, kind of, but they kind of fill up the track more than anything else. So yeah, really happy with how these guys turned out. And then next we have these strings. So I just went to Arcade and looked at the 70s line, and I found this one patch that had a lot of really good string loops. And I just kind of went through, played the ones that I thought sounded good, and then bounced them down as audio. When you are doing that, though, you got to make sure you turn off any of like the effects on Arcade, like reverb or stuff like that, just because it can make it a little bit harder to mix after the fact. But yeah, the thought process behind these strings is when you're adding multiple string parts, you need to make sure that they are different enough, either rhythmically or sonically, to the point where they're not really stepping on top of each other. So these two together are kind of the same, and I almost consider them to be one sound. And then underneath those two, we have this sort of plucky guy. That one's probably my favorite. But yeah, as far as processing, these guys just have a bit of compression on each of them. My opinion with disco strings, at least in like a disco pop setting, is that you kind of want to carve out a lot of the frequencies that are there and just add them on as sort of like a last texture, like almost like the icing on top of the cake, because it can be really easy for them to sort of overwhelm everything else. But yeah, all these guys are going into a group. I used Kramer tape just to sort of degrade the high end in an organic sounding way. Use the small room reverb preset in Ableton, just to sort of make it sound like a live room. And then I used this EQ to sort of high pass out that sort of muddy mid-range. I really only wanted this sort of like higher mid-range part of the sound from those strings. And so I also ended up filtering it out a lot. So I also clipped a little bit off the top. But altogether, they sound like this. Next thing we're going to look at is the bass. So I actually tracked this part with my really cheap Silvertone P bass. And I feel like that's really important to this sound because P basses are really good at sort of staying out of the way of a kick drum. The reason people like P basses so much is because of the pickups that they have. They don't reach down super low into the low end. They sort of stay in that sort of 100 to 250 range, which makes it really easy to mix it with a kick drum that has a lot of low end. And in disco, the kick drum always takes precedent. So if you want to get that disco tone, I would say start with a P bass. Or if you want it to be brighter and be even more the star of the show, I would recommend like a jazz bass. I feel almost like when I was writing this bass part, I was trying to think almost in between being a drummer and being a guitarist almost. Like you've got to keep it in the pocket, keep those strong downbeats. At the same time, since the drums are playing stuff really simple, you're able to do a bit more fill stuff like this. And when people talk about disco bass, they're normally talking about this sort of like moving liquid low end that sort of sweeps around the track itself while still locking in with it. So if you're going to make a disco pop song, I would say spend a majority of your time writing a really catchy bass line, because trust me, it'll be worth it. So I have a pretty simple bass chain set up here. Just some basic EQ. Again, we don't want to cut too low into those lows. We want the kick and the bass to be their own separate thing that can sort of split off from each other and exist and then meet up again. We have some compression, doing just a few dB of gain reduction. CLA's bass plugin from Waves. Just sort of messed around with the default preset till I got something I liked without it. With. Just kind of makes it a bit bigger. And then a little bit of L1 just to tame those peaks. And then I felt like using a little bit more compression on the end of it. I didn't really want to do any processing that was too crazy outside of what they had available in the 70s. And I think this kind of resulted in more of an organic bass tone. All right, next we have the electric guitars. So again, we're kind of viewing these the same way that we view the string section. These guys are going to sort of be rhythmic textures on top of the rest of this track that's very dense and very thick in the mid-range and the low end. So I just used my Strat and played a couple of parts. A great thing to do with disco is always to just play the one. Single note stuff on the pentatonic scale works really well, especially if you have a funky rhythm like this. And then to sort of extend the length of this sort of 8-bar loop that I have going here, I decided to have this sort of fast 2-note slappy part, but only have it play on the 4 every first and third bar. just to give the listener's ear something new to listen to, keep them interested, and also not have the exact same element play every single time. These two basically have the exact same chain. This is Guitar Rig 5. I used the Prince in the Rain preset, but I turned off the reverb in the ensemble, which is basically just this jazz amp and a compressor. Honestly, if you have a decent Strat, a really basic clean tone is going to work really great for spanky stuff. And then to sort of level it out, I have this OTT, which I just kind of use to make the frequencies of that guitar smile a little bit more, like without, with, without, with. It just kind of lifts everything up a little bit. And then again, a little bit of L1 to sort of tame those transients. Especially with a fast picking part like this, it's really easy to have one of these hits be like insanely loud compared to the other. It looks like I did a pretty good performance here, but I still feel like it's worth it to throw a limiter on at the end just to control those transients a bit. All right, then it looks like we can talk about the drums, which are really fun. Let's go through the basic stuff real quick. So we have this kick here, which is the Lenno Kick Lost V2 kick from Splice. Then we also have a Lenno snare. Looks like this is called Lenno Clap Real Deal. I don't know if this is a loop or a one shot that I just comped, but for genres like this, I really like having realistic sounding claps instead of like a sampled clap. For these kind of vintage genres, it just kind of makes it feel more like a live space if you have like a clap that's actually a sample of somebody clapping, if that makes sense. And then it looks like we have one more clap layer, which is just super tiny, barely audible, but I think I just wanted a little bit more high-end excitement at the very end. But as you can see, everything here with these drums is very 4 on the floor. And that's another element of disco. It was kind of one of the first genres that got people like out on the dance floor. And part of why it works so well as a dance genre is because kick drums and snares are always super consistent. That way people always know where the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4 are. If you start getting really crazy with your patterns or start doing like people aren't going to know how to dance to it. So I would recommend keeping it super simple. Also, if you arrange them this way, it's a lot easier for the bass player to do a lot of filler stuff that pops out from the track and raises the song as a whole. But then after those guys, I have a hi-hat. I have a tambourine. We have this hand drum. I kind of wanted this to be like sort of stereo spread thing, so I panned this one a little bit to the right, just because a lot of stuff is kind of in the center or to the left. So this kind of like spreads things out. It almost feels like there's a band on stage and that there's a percussionist over to your right a little bit. Then we have this Oliver loop that I think I wasn't getting enough from just those samples and those loops, so I added this on top. With this sample, I just wanted something that was more stereo panny. I was missing the feeling that I got whenever I make trap songs, where you can just have trap hats that have like auto pan and they just kind of fade everywhere over the top. And I just wanted that feeling here, so I just threw this loop in. And then I think the only other things we have are these two guys, which is a riser and clap impact, of course. And that's everything for my mastering chain. So this is sad. My normal mastering chain bugged out on this one and it wouldn't open. So I just built a new mastering chain from scratch. But I did a lot of the things that I normally do. I went for regular compression instead of upward compression on this song, just because I felt like it's a vintagey sounding genre. So I might as well use more of a vintagey mastering chain. But yeah, just use some infinite EQ to do some subtractive stuff. Mainly subtracting from the sides just to make the low end more mono and tighten up this mid-range stuff. Slate Digital's virtual bus compressor, FG Red, on their glue preset, tweaked a little bit. Barely doing any compression at all, like at max like 1 dB of gain reduction. That's the thing a lot of people don't know about mastering is when you use compression, it can go overboard really quick. So be lighter with your compression. I then have Slate's virtual tape machine, which adds a sort of analog richness to the track. I then decided to use a Pultec EQ just because I felt like it was fitting for this kind of chain. Also, the transformers in this plugin are really cool. They add this really nice sort of high-end saturation thing. And then more Infinity EQ, this time we're boosting on the sides as sort of like a cleaner stereo spreading thing. And then I used Ozone Maximizer as my limiter. And since this is more of a vintage style, I didn't really want to over limit this. I wanted it to have more of the dynamic range from like the classic disco records that I grew up with. So you can see we're only hitting about -15 LUFS. But for some reason, whenever I went above that, it just kind of didn't feel like a disco record to me. It sounded like a slammed pop record. And for my mind, I was keeping it more in that sort of analog, old school disco vibe. But yeah, we're done. So let's look at what all of this sounds like together. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe if you want more of these. Again, I do one of them every Thursday. If you're looking for some reading as an indie artist, last week I did a video where I talked about the top 10 books that I recommend to all indie artists. So you should definitely go check that one out. But yeah, I'll see you guys next week.